Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here and to speak with my esteemed colleagues. And I want to thank the Bavarian Research Center and George Tamer and everyone who's been involved here for the invitation and for making this happen. I want to, I had organized, when I saw 1 hour, I thought I was supposed to be lecturing for 1 hour. So I have a lot of material. I'm going to try and maybe truncate it a little bit at the end. We'll see, so that we have a little bit of time for questions. I build my work on Islamicate authority on the work of Vincent Cornell, who studied Moroccan sainthood and authority. And our approach really generally has been to kind of look at how political Islam has dominated the discussion about and kind of pushed authority to the side, and how really authority was really central to Islamdom and the Islamicate world, prior to the modern period. And so that discussion needs to come back, okay? That there needs to be a recentering of the discourse, just based on a historical perspective, right? So I titled this talk, Authority in Islam When the Prophet Speaks, because the source of authority in Islam as a religion always returns to the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in the Arabian Peninsula between the years 570 and 563 of the Common Era. The medieval theologian and defender of Sunni orthodoxy, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, died 1111, famously reduced belief in Islam to a belief in acceptance of what Muhammad brought. It is not only the Qur'an, which Muslims believe in as a direct revelation from God to Muhammad through the angel Gabriel, that are authoritative in Islam, but it is the words of Muhammad himself, meanings revealed by God in Muhammad's words, his actions, and his tacit approval, that are all the fundamental source texts that demand obedience and reckoning from Muslims. In the Quran, it is stated, لا ينطق عن الهوى ما ضل صاحبكم وما غوى وما ينطق عن الهوى إن هو إلا وحي يوحى, i.e., he does not speak from his vain caprice, i.e., the Prophet. The believers are exhorted in the Quran, لا ترفعوا أصواتكم فوق صوت النبي. Okay, do not raise your voices above the voice of the Prophet. The centrality of the Prophet to Islamicate authority is one that develops and consolidates over time within the Muslim community and solidifies by the 9th century CE, 3rd Islamic century Hijri. I plan to situate Islamicate authority both diachronically in relation to other religious currents within the Nile to Oxus ecumene, as well as phenomenologically as a representation of authority as a mode of human social expression. The attempt here is to put Islamicate authority in conversation with Christian and Jewish expressions of authority. I do not use the term religious authority because it immediately presupposes certain claims of modernity vis-a-vis religion, so as to restrict religion to a realm devoid of power and the exercise of political authority, which was never a foregone conclusion in the pre-modern era. It is an accurate assessment, as Professor Alexander Knish has stated, that Islam represents the continuation of the Semitic tradition of prophecy, albeit in its latest formulation on a grand scale. Nevertheless, the prophetic tour de force brought with it new trappings. The Arabian prophet of Islam came at the head of an army and was not merely a prophet, but claimed to be a messenger on the order of Abraham and Moses, bearing a revelation from God. When looking at the mission of Muhammad within the context of the late antique world of the Nile to Oxus ecumene, one cannot help but be struck by the stark discontinuities as well as the very powerful continuities at play. The consecration of Abraham's sacrifice and the offering of Qurbani on the day of the greater Eid illustrates this. We are currently in the sacred first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah right now. These are the days of the Hajj season and the sacrifice, celebrating the sacrifice of Abraham, which commenced with the feast of al-Eid al-Akbar, the greater festival. The term Qurbani is in Arabic, but we also find Qurbano Qadisho in Syriac and Qurban Pesach in Hebrew, as well as Qurbana in Aramaic. The Prophet Muhammad sacrificed a lamb directly after the Eid prayer, celebrating the performance of the rites of Abraham at Mecca. However, he did not require the sacrifice to occur in a special place, such as the temple in Jerusalem. Nor did he consider the requirement of sacrifice to have been lifted, such as when the crucifixion of Jesus Christ ended all blood sacrifice with his sacrificial blood. The rites of Abraham as performed by the Prophet Muhammad was the continuation of the rite of sacrifice, but in a wholly new form. The Prophet Muhammad was acting within the purview as prophet who, by virtue of his direct communication with God and inspired by the Holy Spirit, Gabriel in the Muslim understanding, not only changed the scope and manner of Abrahamic sacrifice, but revived it anew after it had no longer been practiced by rabbinic Jews or Christians for some 500 years. The practice of Abrahamic sacrifice illustrates an important aspect of Muhammad's mission that it complicates the use of a Weberian framework in understanding Islamicate authority. The teachings of the Prophet Muhammad occur in the absence of any institutional system of authority. Both rabbinic Jewish and early Christian notions of authority exist against the backdrop of the temple, which had institutionalized authority structures in Judaism prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. One might even go further to say that the teachings of Muhammad seem to militate against institutionalization. We'll see how this plays out. I say this not only in regards to pre-existing religious institutions amongst Jews and Christians in the late antique world that Islam came to inhabit, but also in terms of pre-Islamic Arabian religious practices. The same cannot be said for Arabian pre-Islamic social structures, which come to play an important role in how Islamicate authority expresses itself. The Weberian model that juxtaposes charismatic authority to legal and institutional authority against the backdrop of traditional authority tends to obscure, in my opinion, rather than elucidate how Islamicate authority structures develop. All of the lasting forms of Islamicate authority that remain to this day have developed outside of an institutional framework, be it the legal schools, which developed in conscious opposition to the state, as well as Sufi forms of authority and even reformist trends such as Salafism today. I therefore place Islamicate authority in a space somewhere between Weber's charismatic and legal authority. We're going to talk about the term for authority in Islam as Walāya. I place this between Weber's charismatic and legal authority types because this is a social space between the individual and the complex social institution with a legal rational structure. I don't consider Islamicate authority to be purely traditional either. It is not based on the promotion of custom or tradition, although pre-Islamic Arabian social institutions did play an important role in the expression of Islamicate authority. Islamicate authority is dynamic in the sense that it is a negotiated process. Let us take the legal school, for example. The madhab, or legal school, develops outside caliphal control in the early period. It is a network of scholars who identify with a particular legal methodology of a particular representative of the Sunnah. This is very much like Rabbinic Judaism to some extent. The framework is very similar. The legal school produces opinions about the relationship between the Sunnah and the world. The Sunnah is the way of the Prophet. That relationship is ensconced in rulings that are organized in terms of their strength. The qawl of this imam, such as Abu Hanifa ibn Nu'man, is weighed against his students. A process of sifting takes place in which rulings of the school become a body of knowledge. The school speaks on behalf of the Prophet in the absence of the Prophet. The fact that the schools of law develop outside of the state means that the Sharia, as al-Hallaq has stated, became a body of rulings that political actors couldn't really change. In fact, even the ulama, the scholarly elite, with respect to these rulings, had little room to improvise. They could extend the rulings to new situations, but they could not change the substance of the rulings if they were clearly delineated by the Qur'an and the Sunnah. The authority of the school of law is an authority of a collective body of Islamic scholars. Since this scholarly community is constantly changing, it is not necessarily reifying the teachings of the Prophet, but projecting them into new spaces. In speaking on behalf of the Prophet, it is a community that is attempting to amplify and project the prophetic authority. By situating the Prophet Muhammad as a continuation of Semitic prophecy within the Nile to Oxus ecumene, we are pointing to the way in which the Prophet Muhammad made claims to represent the authority of God directly, with the result of even, in a sense, superseding a Judaic structure of prophecy. The continuities and discontinuities are fascinating. In the Quran, 2:129, it states Muhammad is referred to as a great messenger from among them, i.e. the progeny of Abraham and Ishmael. And the statement appears as a prayer of both Abraham and Ishmael to God as they were raising the foundation of the Kaaba as a house of God. Muhammad, as a descendant of Abraham, lays claim to a lineage of prophecy that circumvents the lineage of prophecy or descendants of David. Muhammad represents Islam as more primal than Judaism and prior to the cult of the temple. So while descent from David was an accepted qualification for the claim of prophecy within Judaism, the claim of descent from Abraham through Ishmael not only maintains the important qualification of pedigree, but it both seeks to supersede it and circumvent it. While redemptive sacrifice of the Son plays an important role in both Judaism and Christianity around the transfer of authority to the next generation, this motif is conspicuously absent in early Islamic sources. Nevertheless, Muhammad did have an adopted son, Zayd, whose title of son of Muhammad was removed by the Quran with the abolishment of adoption as a social institution within Islam. At the same time, Muhammad was given the title of seal of the prophets, Khatam al-Nabiyyin, i.e. cutting off the function. So it's also a process of cutting off the function of prophecy for all future generations. So it's a claim of prophecy on the order of Abraham and Moses, but then also a claim to of the ceasing of prophecy as well. These are very kind of like, stark claims. None of Muhammad's sons survived him. It is with the death of the Prophet Muhammad that a split occurs within the community, not over biological inheritance of the prophetic authority of Muhammad, but over the appointment of a successor, i.e. those who come to identify as Shia claim that Muhammad appointed his son-in-law and cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor, both politically and spiritually. Shi'i claims to authority represent traditional Arabian modes of authority transposed onto Islam. It was the clan. Maintaining leadership within the Prophet's clan was assumed. Abbasid claims to authority follow a similar line of reasoning, right? And these become minority claims within Islamdom. Maintaining leadership within the Prophet's clan was assumed. Those who come to be known as Sunnis, however, claim that Muhammad did not appoint a successor upon his death, but left the affair open to the community to choose a leader who would only inherit political and interpretive authority from the Prophet. Here again we can see that with the first Caliph Abu Bakr, the traditional norms of succession in Arabian custom are superseded. Abu Bakr is not the head of an important clan within Quraysh. So according to Arabian custom, he should not be the leader. He consistently acts on his personal knowledge and interpretation of the Prophet's Sunnah. For example, he refuses to give the Prophet's daughter Fatima land as inheritance that was owned by the Prophet, because he states that he heard the Prophet say that prophets do not leave inheritance. There are two main verses of the Quran that establish the place of authority within the Muslim community. The first is the verse which states, "La ikraha fid din," قَدْ تَبَيَّنَ الرُّشْدُ مِنَ الْغَيْ. There is no compulsion in the religion of Islam. Right guidance has been clearly delineated from misguidance. Despite attempts by some legal scholars to say that this verse was abrogated by the verse of the sword, there is no legal consensus on that opinion. Rather, the negation here indicates a negation of the entire category of ikrah or compulsion. The removal of any form of compulsion in the domain of religion within Islam leaves authority as the operative element in demanding religious observance. The use of force to compel observance in certain aspects of outward religious practice remained within the purview of the political and religious authorities, but was weak and limited based on the ease with which one could escape punishment. The general rule, as explicated in this Qur'anic principle, was that religious authorities should command the right and forbid the wrong, but not compel a person to a religious observance. To compel religious observance would negate the reward that follows from self-initiated obedience to God. If, according to Sunni Muslims, Muhammad did not designate any political or spiritual heirs, the role of religious authority would fall to those who possess knowledge of the Qur'an and Sunnah. These would be called the ulama. They are the class of scholars who, like the hachamim of the Amoraic period, were positioned to interpret the Qur'an and ḥadīth as well as maintain the genealogies of knowledge transmission. In other words, a class of individuals developed within the early Muslim community who assumed epistemic authority by virtue of their ability to establish credentials of knowledge competency with respect to the textual sources, as well as produce a pedigree that connected the scholar back to the first generation of companions and then back to Muhammad. While theoretically speaking, knowledge transmission was open to all Muslims, it was only a small group of privileged individuals who had the time, resources, and social position to become one of the ulama. The clash between the supposed egalitarian nature of religious authority as a product of knowledge acquisition on the one hand, and conservative notions of preserved understanding through genealogies of knowledge transmission on the other, came into base relief with the rise of the Khawarij, the 1st century Hijri sect, which first openly challenged the epistemic authority of the companions of the Prophet. They were the group that fought against Ali, the 4th caliph. The second Qur'anic verse that delineates the position of authority of a group of individuals within the Muslim community is the verse that states here, "O you who believe, obey Allah and obey His Messenger, and those who possess the command amongst you. If you contest each other's right, then return the affair to Allah and His Messenger. If you truly believe in Allah and the last day, that is better and more excellent in preference." Here the Qur'an establishes a clear hierarchy of authority within a political sphere. The term l-amr was used by the early Muslim Arabs to indicate political authority up through the Umayyad period. While God is the ultimate authority, Muhammad as the final messenger is the conduit of that authority. This establishes the two authoritative categories of religious text in Islam, the Qur'an and the ḥadīth. The Qur'an is understood to be the literal word of God as revealed to Muhammad over a period of 23 years, from approximately 609 CE until 632 CE. The ḥadīth is a body of collective memory of the Prophet's words, deeds, and tacit approval as transmitted, collected, and redacted by the Muslim community. For Shi'is, the imams appointed successively from generation to generation after Muhammad also constitute sources of continued revealed knowledge from God. There are various different types of Shi'i lineages. One is 5. Generally, the 3 main types are 5, 7, and 12 imams. The verb commanding obedience is ati'u, or all of you obey, and the word precedes both God and the Prophet. However, it is not repeated before the mention of those who possess the command. The later Islamic tradition would interpret those who possess the command to be the political authorities that rule over the Muslim community, as well as the ulama, or the scholarly class. The function of obedience, ta'a, is to bring about cohesive unity in the community. This disobedience corresponds to the authority of the l-amr, those in command. As long as their commands are in line with God and the Prophet, they must be obeyed. However, if they are not in line with the commands of God and the Prophet, then obedience is not required. Here we have a distinction that develops amongst the ulama in the first century after the hijrah between khuruj, which is exiting the community of believers, i.e. outright antagonism towards the community, and al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy al-munkar, or commanding the right and forbidding the indecent. In the early Islamic Sirah Maghazi literature, we have the example of the companions Abu Darda and Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, who contradicted Muawiyah in Syria and the Caliph Uthman in Medina over the issue of zakah, the alms tax. The sense the Muslim ruler, here the sense is that the Muslim ruler is a first among equals, with other companions of the Prophet under the reign of the rightly guided caliphs, but this type of sense would not last. By the time of the caliphs Abd al-Malik and al-Walid, the general al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was executing companions of the Prophet for perceived disobedience. A well-known hadith of the Prophet explicates the principle of obedience mentioned above, which is at-ta'a fil ma'ruf. Obedience is that which is well known to be good, i.e. obedience is required in those things that are well known to be good for a person and for the community. The term al-ma'ruf is a socially and culturally constructed term. That is, it differs in time and place. However, it indicates the idea that collectives tend to maintain ethical standards that must be brought to bear. Obedience is not required in those things that run contrary to what is well known to be good to the collective. Another important hadith about ta'a is the hadith as-sam'u wa-ta'atu al-mar'i al-muslim. على المرء المسلم السمع والطاعة فيما أحب وكره إلا أن يؤمر بمعصية فإن أمر بمعصية فلا سمع ولا طاعة. And this is a hadith. Hearing and obeying is obligated upon each Muslim. So this is a hadith. This is a saying that's transmitted from the Prophet. Hearing and obeying is obligated upon each Muslim in both what he likes and dislikes, as long as he is not commanded to commit a sin. For if he is commanded to commit a sin, then there is no hearing or obedience required of him. Therefore, not only is there a hierarchy of authority established by the Qur'an, however, that authority is qualified by an ethics that is both communally established and predicated on the notion of individual responsibility and accountability before God. This hierarchy is generally understood in a centralized and top-down sense, in which the l-amr are considered to be the political rulers and the ulama, or the scholarly class, who derive their authority from their connection to the Prophet. Now I'm going to also bring in kind of a more decentralized form of authority that's also represented in the Quran. In addition to a vertical hierarchy, we find a decentralized hierarchy of authority explicated in the Quran in the advice given by the wise man Luqman to his son. He orders his son to obey his parents in all those things that do not contradict the commands of God. He then counsels him to follow the way of the person who is ever returning in devotion to God. He says, "Ittabi' sabila man anaba ilayh." Follow the way of the one who is ever returning in devotion to God. So this is وَإِن جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَىٰ أَن تُشْرِكَ بِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ فَلَا تُطِعْهُمَا. But if they, i.e. your parents, push you to associate with me that which you have no knowledge of, then do not obey them, but keep well their company in this life and follow the way of the one who turns constantly in devotion to me. In time you will return to me, and I will inform you all of what you have been doing. Okay, so this sets up the authority of parents is like now right underneath the authority of God. Okay, so you have the l-amr, that's like a political. Okay, and then you have like kind of at a decentralized level, you have parents are given authority as long as they don't say or do anything, command one to do anything that contradicts God and the Prophet. Okay, So, and according to Islamic law, this is anything that is considered hateful, or that's called makruh, which is hateful, or haram, which is prohibited. Okay, outside of that, technically, in the Islamic tradition, if a parent orders the child to do something, from an Islamic legal perspective, the child is sinful if they do not follow what the parent told them to do. Okay? So this decentralized hierarchy begins with God, then follows with one's parents, and then ends with those who show exemplary worship and devotion to God. So after the parents, who then does one follow? One follows a person who is righteous. Okay? So there's another hierarchy going on here. Just like the vertical hierarchy, obedience to God and the Prophet take precedence. The command to obey one's parents in all that does not contradict the commandments of God fragments and decentralizes authority. There are numerous attestations in the ḥadīth literature in which the wishes of one's parents take precedence over the command of the political ruler. Just like the example of when a companion came to the Prophet and said his mother needed companionship, and so he said, well, then you need to stay and not go out on the campaign, out of righteousness towards the parent. Then the Qur'an makes an interesting turn. In it, God commands the believers to follow the path of those who are righteous. Further qualification is given in other parts of the Qur'an, in which those who have a right to be followed are described as not asking for a wage, ajr, and not asking for any sustenance, rizq. We will see later how this becomes an important credential in the claim of Sufis to Islamicate authority. Okay? So, ittabi'u man la yas'alukum ajran wa hum muhtadun. Okay? So, follow those who do not ask of you a wage and who are all the while rightly guided. And also in the Quran, in numerous places, it talks about prophets who, as an argument for their authoritativeness, they say, I'm not asking anything of you. I'm not asking you for a wage, and I'm not asking you for any sustenance. I'm just transmitting what God told me to transmit to you. So this becomes an element of authoritative, or of a claim to authoritativeness. Okay? That the person who can say, I'm not taking anything for what I'm giving, means that now, you can follow me. Okay? That's one element, besides others which are like requirements of knowledge. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shāfiʿī, died 204 Hijri, is credited with the first articulation of Islamic legal methodology as a discipline with his book Ar-Risala. It was a text that was ahead of its time, and it laid out the sources for derivation of Islamic rulings and how those sources should relate to one another. The next major work in Islamic legal theory that is extant would be the Hanafi scholar Abu Bakr Ahmad al-Jassas, 370, over a century and a half later. After al-Jassas, there would be a flurry of works on Islamic legal methodology. It's hard to overestimate the importance of al-Shāfiʿī's contribution to the development of Islamic law, which addressed directly the authoritativeness of the prophetic sunnah in the issuance of legal verdicts. Al-Shāfiʿī was concerned with developing consistency in rulings and minimizing the effect of personal preference amongst judges, Islamic judges. His project could not be fully implemented, however, until a canonical body of ḥadīth would be gathered and accepted as reflective of the Prophet's sunnah. So this happens after al-Shāfiʿī. Okay, so in a sense, al-Shāfiʿī set up a legal methodological framework that required the collection of this ḥadīth corpus, and then it was collected, okay, and sifted out to be verified. So that's one. I mean, there are several. There are questions like, why is there this huge gap in methodology between al-Shāfiʿī and al-Jassas? Like, there are a lot of different opinions. However, I would like to put forward the idea that, well, it was that way because what Ash-Shafi'i brought, in a sense, called up the need for this type of, this activity of collecting and sorting the ḥadīth in the way that it was done, and that further developments of usul or legal methodology couldn't develop until that was done, right? Again, that's just my idea. The collection and canonization of the hadith into 6 main collections took place in the century that followed Ash-Shafi'i's death. The 2 most famous of these collections were the collection of Muhammad al-Bukhari, died 256-870, and the collection of Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, 261-875. It is with the canonization of the hadith in the 3rd Islamic century and early 10th century that a full picture of the Prophet's sunnah emerges. Jonathan Brown discusses the emergence of the Sunan Sahih movement as epitomized by al-Bukhari's Sahih that sought to achieve a high level of narrator authenticity while also covering a breadth of topics that match topics already developed in the field of Islamic jurisprudence or fiqh. Okay, so here with the collection and canonization of the hadith, a full picture of who the Prophet was, in a sense, doesn't take place. And once that happens, then it becomes decisive, okay, from a legal perspective. And it has a lot of effects. It has a lot of effects on Sufism. It has a lot of effects on many different disciplines after the 3rd Islamic century. Ash-Shafi'i made Ash-Shafi'i was instrumental in defining how Islamicate authority would be understood in its normative sense. The first was in his association of the ulama with the awliya. Now we have this term wali and awliya come into play. We're going to see that a lot. The terms wali and wilaya will be explained later in this paper. However, suffice it to say that the wali is someone who enjoys the mark of God's grace and divine protection, and thus others may come to enjoy some aspects of this protection vicariously through that individual. One might think of Sadiq in the rabbinic tradition, or Qadisho in the Syriac Christian tradition. Ash-Shafi'i is famous for having claimed that if the scholars of Islam, the ulama, are not God's awliya, then God doesn't have any awliya. Okay? Ash-Shafi'i did not equate the ulama with the awliya, but made a strong claim that the ulama were the best contenders for this type of divine election. Later we will discuss how Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, the first theorist to discuss Walāya in detail, was to deal with the same basic proposition. The second claim of Ash-Shafi'i was that the term hikmah in the Qur'an, or wisdom, hukmah, as mentioned in the Qur'an, was nothing other than the sunnah of the Prophet himself. Hence, hikmah would come to be equated with hadith. Okay, so in the Quran it says God sent down the book and wisdom. Okay, so if you say that, okay, wisdom is the hadith, then you're done. Okay, it's easy, right? Because you say hikmah is hadith. Now, if you say that, well, hikmah is like the, like the wisdom that Luqman has, well, that's a completely different scenario, because wisdom can be, anyone who's even not prophets, anyone has access to wisdom, okay? So this is a type of divine, okay? So Ash-Shafi'i kind of like creates a nice, neat little box here, okay? And so, again, that has a lot of weight, okay, in the tradition and lasts a long time. Hence, hikmah would come to be equated with hadith. By equating hikmah with sunnah, Ash-Shafi'i was sidestepping the thorny question of divinely vouchsafed knowledge given to those who are not prophets. The status of hikmah, or wisdom, as a type of knowledge is also addressed in detail by Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi. And the status of hikmah plays an important role in how authority is restricted in Islam. In a sense, Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi and Al-Shafi'i, they have these two perspectives on hikmah, okay? And they're kind of like, Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi comes just not that long after Al-Shāfiʿī. If knowledge is the hallmark of the ulama, and the ulama are the representatives and inheritors of the prophetic authority, then the nature of that knowledge must be restricted or at least qualified so that it is not abused. And Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi restricts it in a different sense. Okay, so both of them attempt to restrict this authority to the ulama. Also, if hikmah is sunnah, then sunnah is another form of revelation of a lesser degree. Hikmah is then not accessible as divinely gifted knowledge to be claimed by anyone. At-Tirmidhi's approach is more nuanced. For At-Tirmidhi, hikmah is a degree higher than knowledge, and one only attains hikmah if one already has knowledge. Okay, so he creates, there's the ulama, the hukama, and then the awliya. Okay, so if you want to have hikmah and you don't have ilm, which is the knowledge base, the legal, theological, then you can't do that. Okay, it's like there's this door, okay, and you have to go through the door and you have to go the right way, otherwise you don't get there. Okay. However, for At-Tirmidhi, hikmah is not divinely gifted knowledge. So he doesn't say that is called ma'rifah and is for the awliya. For At-Tirmidhi, hikmah is knowledge of the world and the self that accrues through experience. It is also knowledge of how to implement the sharia practically. Hikmah is a means towards receiving divinely vouchsafed knowledge from God. Al-Shāfiʿī and At-Tirmidhi are concerned with defining who the ulama are and how their knowledge bequeaths them religious authority. The 3rd and 4th Islamic centuries saw a crisis of authority in Islamdom, with a number of competing visions of Islamicate authority solidifying into movements. What precipitated this crisis of authority was the weakening of the Abbasid Caliphal house and the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate, with the consonant rise of the Shi'i Buyid dynasty, proffering competing claims to Islamic normativity. The discourse around competing claims to religious authority took on the vocabulary of Walāya, and those who enjoyed special divine protection styled as the awliya, plural of wali. Ibn Abi Dunya was a compiler and transmitter of ḥadīth who worked under the auspices of the Abbasid Caliphal court, and he produced a collection of ḥadīth specifically about the awliya, titled Kitab al-Awliya, in the latter part of the 3rd, 9th century. Ibn Abi Dunya positions the supporters of the caliph as the awliya. For those who represented the scholarly class, it was the ulama who were the awliya. For Sufis, it was those who received divinely gifted knowledge who were the awliya, outside the governmental institutions of the caliphal state. After the 3rd, 9th century, we find an increasing inclusion of creedal statements that call for the belief in the awliya in Islamic theology and the acceptance of their miracles. The first instance of a theological discourse around the awliya occurs with the statements in Kitab al-Sidq of Abu Sa'id al-Kharraz about the clear superiority of prophets over the awliya, the saints. It is assumed that there must have been a group of Muslims who claimed that the awliya can reach spiritual degrees that are greater than prophets, most likely basing the claim on the story mentioned in the Qur'an in Surah Al-Kahf about Moses and the man who taught him spiritual knowledge from God. Okay, so you can see how Sufis kind of try to explode this version, this idea of this box that Al-Shāfiʿī kind of creates. Okay, if you see this story, right, which is right in the middle of the Qur'an, which is a story about Moses who becomes a companion to a man who was given knowledge directly by God. Okay, and that through the various different happenings that happen to the both of them, he teaches Moses. Okay, so here says, there they found a servant of ours to whom we had bestowed an immense mercy from ourselves, and we had taught knowledge from our very self. Moses said to him, may I follow you on condition that you teach me from that which you were taught of guidance? okay? And Moses fails the test, okay? He can't, because every time he does something wrong according to the law, Moses upbraids him for it, okay? As the one who brought the law, right? But then he says, well, let me explain to you why I did what I did, okay? At the end. So, but this is someone who's not a prophet, who's teaching a prophet. So it's kind of like, it gets complicated, right? In the exegetical tradition, this man is styled as Khidr, a mysterious figure who epitomizes the man who is not a prophet, but who receives divinely vouchsafed knowledge. Numerous points of theological argumentation seem to emerge within the Kalam discourse from positions of Christian dogma or polemics. One such point of theological argumentation is the strawman positions of the Qadariyya, those who believe in Qadar or human free will, and the Jabriyya, those who believe in God's overpowering Jabr or predestination. Unlike the theological discussions that emerge from disagreements between the Khawarij and the Caliphal establishment over political rule and the place of sin and the identity of a Muslim, the Qadariyya-Jabriyya polemic simply provides a backdrop against which Muslim theologians of the 8th and 9th centuries will state their claims. So this is my idea, okay? Again, take it for what it's worth. I believe that the status of the awliya vis-a-vis the prophets arises in a similar context, in which Christian statements about the superiority of the disciples of Jesus over the prophets formed a backdrop against which Muslim theologians stated their unequivocal support for the superiority of prophets over the awliya. Nevertheless, the creedal texts of the 3rd, 9th century maintain the existence of individuals, both male and female, who enjoy God's special protection and who can be known through their karamat or miracles, which are different than mu'jizat or miracles performed by prophets. No governing body develops in Islam with the authority to beatify these saints. Ultimately, they are only known by God. However, a saint can know him or herself, and others can come to know that a person is one of the awliya through signs and miracles that appear upon that person. However, there always remains a level of ambiguity about the status of a particular person's sainthood, objectively speaking. Okay, I'm going to have to jump forward here because of the time. I actually thought that this was going to be, yeah. Okay, so one of the points that I want to bring up here is that, you know, Islamicate authority kind of militates against institutionalization. Notice this idea of like not taking any wage, okay? So the Sufis, they will argue that, well, we're not taking any wage from the government because the government used to, the Abbasid state used to provide large amounts of resources to Muslim scholars to support their scholarly endeavors, right? So really this was, and some people think that the Sufis were somehow outside of the scholarly establishment. They were not. They were ḥadīth folk who were scholars who went into mysticism, okay? So when they made claims of authority, they said, we're not taking any money from the state. So we are a better source of authority than the ulama who are taking from the state. And here you get this kind of like, there's this discourse because Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who is the figure who is basically the Ahl al-Hadith or the traditionists and traditionalists kind of champion as the one who stood up to the Abbasids, okay, and said, we're not going to let the Abbasid ruling house kind of like make statements about Islamic theology that then like applies to the Ummah. So there are like, it's interesting because you see statements in which, or stories about Ahmad ibn Hanbal in which it says, well, you know, he wouldn't eat the fish from the river because he saw that as tainted, okay, by i.e. the source of the food that the fish ate somehow could be traced back to the caliphal, state, and so, out of his wara', out of his righteousness, he wouldn't even eat the fish, okay? But then there are other claims in which he actually took stipends from the government. So you see how there's like this debate, right, that really is about, okay, and it goes back to this kind of Qur'anic precedent, which is around like whether a person takes money from the state or not, and even the Sufis went further to say, well, even gainful employment kind of like makes you suspicious, right, as someone who is not entirely like dependent only on God, right? Now, one of the things that I want to show here also, which I don't have time to present here, is how I said, Walāya is like in the middle between kind of like charismatic and institutional authority. So I then take Alexander Kojev's model of authority to kind of expand that middle. Okay? And when I compare Alexander Kojev's model, okay, he says here, okay, like how much, when we talk about Walāya, okay, how much of it like overlays with the term that we're talking about in terms of when we use the term authority, okay? So one of the things, his model like matches almost like exactly with how Islamicate authority works. He has four different types, okay? The authority of the father, the master, the leader, and the judge, okay? These and how they work, okay? Because he says that the judge is a combination of the father, master, and leader, okay? So if you look at, and these are, they kind of like develop sui generis, like they're separate, okay? If you look at Islamicate authority, okay, the authority of the father is established by the Quran, and the authority of the master over the slave, the authority of the leader, the judge, is actually a combination of all these three. So it matches very neatly. But the question that I'm asking is, okay, well, what's different then about Walāya as opposed to authority, okay, as a term, right? And what I found is that, see, Walāya requires, it's more social because there's an ethical element that's embedded in the very term itself. Whereas authority, you can be, you can abuse your authority, you can, like it's not, there isn't an ethical element that's like embedded in the term itself. Whereas Walāya assumes that the person who has Walāya is protecting and fulfilling the needs of the person who's under their authority. Okay? It's like part of the term, they can't be separated. Right? And it's also, in authority you have like two people, whereas Walāya you have to have three people. Okay? Because the Walāya is also protecting from someone outside. Okay? Not just someone who's obeying the person who's underneath them. So anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that Walāya as a discourse is something very close to what we see as authority, but it has its own dimensions. And that has effects in the modern period, okay, for how like Muslims view political authority, right? And it also has to do with how Muslims see their religious figures, right? And what I don't have time to get to is kind of where this all factors in terms of the modern period with the Sufi Salafi discourse, which is really about authority, okay? Because Salafism is a type of Islamic modernism that wants to remove the authority figures of the alim and of the Sufi sheikh, right? So that removal is a very modern, the idea of the person going directly to the text, okay? Interpreting the text for themselves, right? a very kind of, so the Sufis aligned themselves with the ulama, and the Salafis were basically trying to promote this idea that the authority figures had gotten it all wrong, okay? The traditional authority figures. And so that is the main debate that's happening right now in the Muslim community between Sufi traditionalists and Salafi modernists. And so that's where we're at. And what's interesting to me is not just that, but how the two are actually kind of coming together towards a middle ground. Okay, with scholars like Sheikh Muhammad al-Zuhaili, where this idea of genealogy plus ijtihad, which is independent legal reasoning, that these two things kind of, it was like it was out of balance, and they're trying to kind of bring it together towards a place in which both of those things reach kind of a happy medium. And so it's not like the debate is just polarized completely. In fact, the debate seems to be bringing these two sides to some common place. And I'm done. I'm sorry about that. I apologize.